you. Psalm 139. Amazing Psalm 139, isn't it? And it's said that the three Omni doctrines are in this Psalm. Verses 1 to 6 is the omniscience of God. God is all knowing. And verses 7 to 12, the omnipresence of God. Where can I go? He says, from your presence, from your spirit, in verse 7. And then the omnipotence of God, verses 13 to 16, talks there about God's power in design, in creation, forming David in his mother's womb, his inward parts. Let's look at for tonight from verse 7, if we would, please. And I'll read it to you. Verse 7, and David is the psalmist, and he says in verse 7, where can I go from your spirit, speaking to God? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there. So he starts in verse 7 with a question, where can I go from your spirit? And David, considered the truth that God is present everywhere. That's the teaching of omnipresence. God is present everywhere. Then there's no corner or dimension of the universe hidden from him. And then he says, if I ascend into heaven, you are there. And if I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there. Heaven isn't too high and hell isn't too low for God. For God is everywhere. Though David did not use the specific word for hell that we would use for that place of everlasting torment, the sense would be the same. Even in hell, God will be present, because there's no place where God cannot be. Yet God's presence in hell, these are solemn thoughts, folks, will radiate none of his love and grace, only his righteous judgment. He continues in his speaking here in verse 9, if I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. Now, the wings of the morning, this may refer to the spread and speed of light as it fills the morning sky from east to west. Now, David as a shepherd would have seen this when he was looking after the sheep, possibly. The early rays of light come into the earth. This sentence here he's put in, if I take the wings of the morning, it may refer to the spread and speed of light as it fills the morning sky from the east to the west. Light itself cannot outrun God's presence and knowledge. The idea is that if he could fly with the rapidity of light and could be in an instant over the sea, even beyond its remotest border, still God would be there before him. He could not escape from the divine presence. And in verse 10 he says, even there your hand shall lead me. David was so assured of the constant presence of God's hand of love and care that not even death and the grave could separate him from God's love, as Paul would later write in Romans 8. In fact, God's right hand, his hand of skill and strength, would hold David no matter what may come to him. Verse 11, he says, if I say, surely the darkness shall fall on me, even the night shall be light about me. Indeed, verse 12, the darkness shall not hide from you, but the night shines as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to you. God's presence with David was like a constant light in the darkness. You know, we remember in Israel, they had when they were in the wilderness, there was the pillar of cloud that illuminated Israel in the wilderness in Exodus 13:21. And so with God's presence, the night shines as the day, David is saying, because God's presence is everywhere. God is with him. God is with us in his omnipresence. So the teaching here is that God, when we look at this teaching of omnipresence, God is everywhere present at all times in all creation. That's an amazing statement to make, that, isn't it? God is everywhere present at all times in all creation. I looked up what Islam says about Allah, and I asked that question: is Allah? We know Allah is not. He's a false god. It's a false religion. But I looked it up. Is Allah omnipresent? And I got two replies very similar. And I'll read one of them to you. Allah is above his heavens, on his throne, over his creatures. So, not omnipresent. That was it. So, not omnipresent. So, here's this picture of Allah, this person who doesn't exist. And this is coming from the followers of Islam. Allah sits on his throne and he doesn't move. He doesn't come near his people in time of trouble. So don't bother praying to Allah, the compassionate and the merciful that they call him, because he's up there and you're down here. He's not going to come off his throne for you and see to your needs and problems. He's not a God who's going to show up when he is needed. Allah doesn't exist, and he certainly, if he did exist, he wouldn't be omnipresent. That is only God, the triune God, who is omnipresent. Now, an unusual word, isn't it, in the English language, omnipresent. Where's that come from? Well, there are what you call the omni attributes, and omni just is Latin for all. So God is omnipresent. He's all present. He's here. He's there. He's everywhere at the same time. He's at your right hand. He's in your living room right now. He's in my living room. He's in my house. He's in my street. He's in my. He's in Highton. He's in Liverpool. He's in England. He's everywhere. He's across the world. God is everywhere at the same time. There are three attributes of God called Omni. One is omniscience. God is all-knowing. God is omnipotent. God is all-powerful. And God is omnipresent. God is present at all times. It's been said that omnipresence, the omnipresence of God, is the hardest for us to grasp, because We can only be, believe it or not, in one place at a time. But God is everywhere at the same time. But we're not alone in this condition, if you like. Only God is omnipresent. Only the triune God of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is omnipresent. All of the beings, all of the created beings, all the spiritual beings in heaven are restricted to a place and a time. It's worth mentioning for our benefit as well that Satan is not omnipresent. He's not all-powerful, and he's not omniscient. Worth remembering that, because he is a liar, and he likes us to think that he's all-powerful, if we would believe him, that he's all-present. He's not. So in answer to the question that you may get asked, where is God? Or where is your God? The Christian can reply from this doctrine. The Christian can respond with this answer: he is everywhere present. He is here right now. So I want to just bring some points out which help us, I hope, to consider this teaching more. Firstly, God in his essence is invisible to the human eye. He's invisible in his person. We cannot physically see him because God has made us that way that we can't see the things that are invisible. When we look at this teaching of God's omnipresence, the truth of this teaching is that he is present with us even though we do not realize it. Martin Lloyd-Jones said, the fundamental thing, the most serious thing of all about God's omnipresence is that we are always in the presence of God. Now, be true to ourselves. Are we always conscious of that? There was a book which a lot of you will be familiar with from, it's still in circulation, but it was quite popular in the 80s. And it was written by a French monk, Brother Lawrence. It was called Practicing the Presence of God. It was written before the Reformation. And there are some things in there which are hard to swallow for evangelical. But that book called Practicing the Presence of God was written by this monk, and he was a cook in the monastery, and all he did was cut up carrots, peel potatoes, and clean floors. But his desire was constantly, his great desire was to always and in everything seek the glory of God and look for his glory in all that he did. And he's practicing the presence of God. Now, that is a thing to consider, isn't it? If God is present always with us, are we serious-minded enough? Are we conscious enough to practice the presence of God who is with us always? One writer said that God's presence is like the air we breathe. Air is, as we know, is odorless, tasteless, invisible, unless it's polluted, obviously. But most of the time, we don't even think, do we, about the air that we breathe. Yet we depend on it for our very existence. Even so, God's presence is everywhere with us. And if it were withdrawn, none of us could survive for even one moment. God is here. He is beside us. We should never believe that God is far removed in any shape or form. We should never behave in our lives as if he is not near us in a geographical sense. Before I was a Christian, I did believe in God. I had a mental assent there was a God. But I used to think that he was somewhere out there in the universe, not really too bothered about me, not really too bothered about what was going on in my life. That was my view of God. That's a wrong idea when we consider the omnipresence of God. We should never behave in our lives as if he is not near us in a geographical sense. This is what the apostle Paul was trying to get across to the Greeks in Athens when he saw the idolatry. He saw the idols and the images there that were worshipped. He said of the living God, he said, in him we live and move and have our being. That was the preaching that he brought to the Athenians. God is everywhere present. Now, secondly, God is present, which means he cannot be localized in a city or a popular nation, a particular nation. Israel were the Old Testament people of God. God made a covenant with the Jews. And if they kept that covenant, if they kept his laws, then he would bless them. He would protect them from their enemies. He would bless their marriages and children, and he would send the early and the latter rains on their crops. He gave them precious promises. But if they broke his covenant, he pronounced that if they continued in their rebellions against him, then he would withdraw his blessings and send his cursings upon the land and the people. He sent the prophets. He gave them time, but they continued in their rebellion. And eventually God sent the Assyrians, and then he sent the Babylonians, and they took the people out of the land. In AD 70, Israel no longer existed as a nation, and for the next 2,000 years they didn't exist as a nation. But God had a special relationship with Israel. They had a temple in Jerusalem, Solomon's temple, and God's presence was said to be in that temple. But once they disobeyed, once they sinned against the covenant against God, God's presence left the temple. So that was a temporary arrangement with the Old Testament people of God. But God doesn't call us to, doesn't call a particular nation anymore that he deals with only. He's not localized in a city. In other words, he doesn't call us to go to a shrine somewhere, a special place where we can worship him. Now, again, looking at the Islamic faith, they, as a Muslim in their lifetime, if they're going to be a good Muslim, one of the things they should do is go to Mecca in Saudi Arabia and worship there in that city, worship Allah. It's a pilgrimage which they're called to go on. Christians are not called to go on pilgrimages to special places to worship God. You can worship God right where you are at this very moment. You can pray to him. Your prayer is just as valuable and just as heard more than someone who's praying in a magnificent building which costs a lot of money to construct and has got a great name as a Christian place. Your prayer in your locker, in your little room, your living room, wherever you are, your worship is just as acceptable where you are sitting, even right now. He doesn't have a holy place where we can meet. In fact, he does have a special people. And those special people are those who have been born again of his Spirit, who have been regenerated by his Spirit, and who are in fellowship and a relationship with him. You know, when we were able to go to America a few years ago, and I like America, and I've met lots of nice Americans. But you know, when you go to America, you get this a lot, certainly where we went. God bless America. This is God's own country. You know, this is the greatest nation on the earth. I heard all that stuff. But, you know, they're quite wrong in what they say. God is not an American, firstly. He doesn't favor one particular nation above another. His presence is just as much in China as it is in America, as it is in the UK. God is everywhere. There's no place that he is not, which means he cannot be localized in a city or a particular nation. God is everywhere at the same time. Thirdly, God is present even in the worst moments of life. You know, when you hear things like a disaster's happened, a tragedy, people come up with the question, don't they? They may even come up to you as a Christian. Where was God when that happened? Where was God when my daughter was killed? Or when that tragedy happened? That's a popular thing to happen today, isn't it? Where was God? Well, you see, we understand God's omnipresence. Well, he's right in the midst of suffering. He's not hiding somewhere. He's not got out the way while the suffering's going on, the troubles are going on. God is in the midst of suffering, pain, and sickness. He is there in the midst of sorrow and anger and grief. He's there in the midst of bitterness and betrayal and divorce. He is in the midst of the most horrible things: murder, rape, sexual abuse, war and famine, earthquakes. God is there. He's in the midst of all these things. Every natural disaster, pandemics, COVID-19. Where's God? He's right there. He's right with us. Even when we heard of this tragedy, this woman who was murdered, Sarah Everard, murdered by a policeman. That was horrendous, wasn't it? We should never be ashamed of our answer to somebody who asks us that question. We should never be ashamed to answer, well, God, my faith tells me that God was there. And that leads to more questions, doesn't it? Which most of the time we'll find very difficult to answer. But that is the truth of who God is and what we believe. God is right there in the midst of human suffering, tragedy and outrage, wars and famines. He's there in the midst. That's what God's presence, omnipresence, teaches us. But we still have to portray in balance the character of God as the answer to such people's questions as where was God? What was God doing? Fourthly, the teaching that God is everywhere present, God is omnipresent at the same time, means for the Christian that God is always available to us whenever we go to him. He is always available to us whenever we go to him, 24 hours a day. There's a cliche in the business world. We say we're open 24/7, 365 days of the year. It's a nice cliche for your business, isn't it? But the truth is we can go to God 24 hours a day. He never slumbers, the Bible says, nor sleeps. We always have his full attention as his believing people. We don't have to have an appointment to meet with God. He's never too busy for you and me to hear us pray and speak with him. He's never preoccupied with other problems. You know, imagine if you prayed and an angel was to reply, say, I'm sorry, but God's busy at the moment. There's a major crisis in the Middle East. And can you leave your name and someone will get back to you? That is not omnipresence. That is not our God. Our God is always available for us 24/7. He's always, his ear is always open. His heart is always ready for us. God is available to the believer. Though there be 1,000 wars in 1,000 places, our God hears us as if you were the only one who is praying. Fifthly, God is always present whether we believe it or not. You know, the omnipresence of God means God doesn't miss a thing. And, you know, the teaching is God is here, there, he's everywhere. There's no place where he is not. He doesn't miss a thing. I think if we were able to sit down with a sympathetic, unsaved sinner and talk to them about this teaching, the omnipresence of God, I think it would frighten them to realize the God with whom we have to deal with. It would frighten them to realize that most people, the majority of people, have got no idea, no clue about God's character, about God's attributes. So this is a foreign language, can even be a foreign language to Christians. But you know, it's also the omnipresence, the teaching of the omnipresence of God is also a pushback, which leads us, the Christian, to a move forward. You know, to the Christian in our walk with God, if we practice God's presence moment by moment, it would be the motivator to becoming a more sanctified, a more holy Christian, to become consciously aware that God is with me. God is always with me wherever I go. He is always present. Wherever I go, wherever I walk, wherever I see, whatever I say, God is present. He doesn't miss anything. We must remember he's a loving God. He's not present so he can catch us out and tick a load of boxes. You failed there, you failed this. God wants us to have a loving relationship, a holy relationship with him. And it's another step in our faith, I think, to realize the omnipresence of God, the reality of that. To practice the presence of God in our lives is what his desire for us is. You know, it would make me a better Christian if I implemented this teaching of practicing God's presence continually. It would lead to a desire to mortify, to put to death the things that are wrong in my life, the sins that so easily beset me, to realize that he is always present with us is an incredible thing to come to terms with. I'll leave it there. But read on. Psalm 139. Take in the truth that God is omnipresent. He is with us. He's with us. He is present everywhere at all times. Amen.